Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about gender theory more specifically, now that we have a little bit of a grounding about the idea that sex and gender are seen as two separate concepts, sex being a focus on the biological and physiological male and female sexed body, and gender being something that is socially constructed, although there's different ways of understanding that from different theoretical perspectives. So I'm going to continue to give a little bit of a grounding around some notions that help to understand the basis in which different theories are built on. So one of those is the idea that there are stereotypes around gender. That doesn't mean, of course, that all male people take up these kinds of stereotypes. The idea is that masculinity is socially constructed and it has many different kinds of expressions, but there are particular stereotypes that we attach to our social understanding of masculinity, and I think that you might recognize some of these. So one might be the stereotype of strength, the idea that the man is protective, so protective of his family, for example, and also the idea that there's an assertiveness to masculinity and maybe a competitiveness, so that sets men up better, perhaps, in terms of those stereotypes for being leaders, and also for playing competitive sports, for example. The second stereotype is that men are not concerned with their appearance. They're more concerned about their strength and also maybe their minds, their intellectual ability, in some kind of stereotypes of masculinity, but not so much about fashion or about kind of cosmetic products or anything like that. So there's not so much of an emphasis around masculinity on the way that men look, their appearance, or a judgment about that. This is the stereotype, not the actual way that we experience gender in everyday life. Another stereotype is the idea, as I said, about intellectual capacity, the capacity to be rational, logical, objective, not to be swayed by emotion. So those kind of ideas around masculinity. And then finally, the idea that men are preoccupied by sex and have high levels of sexual libido. Whereas on the other hand, some of the traits that have been stereotyped around notions of femininity are, again, these are not necessarily taken up by all women, but there are stereotypes that we might perhaps recognize around some of those ideas of what it is to be feminine. So to be soft, to be caring, to be understanding, to nurture others. We can see this, for example, in the way little girls are given particular kinds of toys that they're expected to develop their understanding of their femininity around, their dollies, and so on. To be feminine is to be preoccupied with your appearance, that appearance is the most important thing about how you look, and of course that has consequences socially for the judgment of value of women. So the stereotype has implications for how we see different women and the kinds of sense of value that they bring in different social contexts. That's historical and associated with stereotypical notions of femininity. The idea that somehow women are they have less intellectual capacity, that they tend to be over emotional, maybe even irrational, and this has real kind of implications, for example, in professional contexts, when people are making judgments about who should take on a more authoritative position, for example. They may be seen as stereotypically as not very good at practical activities like fixing a car, for example, and that their preoccupation is not with sex, but it is with romantic forms of love. So, we can see that in the way that products or movies or books are kind of marketed towards a female audience, not because that they are female, but because of these stereotypes around femininity and what is seen to appeal to women. So these are stereotypes. So and they have history, so they are important. But they are not the only way that we can express femininity and masculinity. But they're important because they occupy a particular, presence in our imagination about what a woman or a man might be like because of these kinds of stereotypes around masculinity and femininity. And of course, nobody ever really fits these stereotypes in any kind of, conformative way, but they're dominant traits that we think about and we assign to people based on what we perceive their gender to be. So this is very important because it's a relational thing. It's about how we perceive somebody else as being a certain kind of person. And with this, there's a sense in our society that these stereotypes are not just traits, but they're also characteristics that are natural, that it's more natural for women to take up more caring, nurturing roles, and it's more natural for men to take up more competitive, assertive roles, and so on. So that has implications as well. And this idea of being natural kind of feeds into, this idea that there's night and day, that's natural, there's yin and yang, there's this natural balance, there's positive and negative, and that kind of extends to these constructions of human bodies, that human bodies are naturally masculine or feminine, which of course is, sociologists would argue, is not natural, but it is actually something that happens through socialization, through social construction, through these kinds of ongoing historical stereotypes and ways that we understand gender traits and characteristics. So how is it that we develop gender then? So of course there are sociobiologists who believe that gender traits are largely biological and biologically determined. However, most sociologists would agree that gender itself, gender is a socially learned behavior. Gender is not biological. It's something that we learn from the beginning of our lives, really, and that we develop in relation to the others that we encounter and to the social context that we encounter, as well as the different social institutions that in which we become socialized. The most prominent perspective is that, as I said, that we're socialized from a very early age, maybe even from birth, or even before birth, perhaps. So the idea of gender socialization is really important for the sociology of gender. And from the time we're born, we might be socialized along gendered lines. So, one of the first questions that we might ask is it a boy or is it a girl? And that becomes even earlier now that we can determine the sex of a baby before a baby is born. And we might already start buying particular kinds of products that are around what we think should be fitting for a girl or a boy. So for example, we might think that we buy little baby grows that are pink or blue because we are thinking about how, what's appropriate for a particular kind of gender. We might think about toys differently, the kinds of toys we should be giving boys or girls. We might have different sections in stores that are kind of girl aisles and boy aisles. The promotion of different toys will be different around those gender stereotypes. So there's a whole host of ways that we start to learn what it is, what it might mean to be a boy or a girl, and it almost becomes a sense of being natural. but we're going through a process of socialization, gender socialization. And with this, of course, it's always connected to the ways in which we're socialized into heterosexuality, that is often kind of the underpinning assumption around the way that our gender roles and conformity are being built over time. So the two are very interlinked. And it's important that, socialization happens early on in the family, but it's not just by the parents, it's also beyond the immediate parental or guardian sort of influence. It's also peers that we come into contact in schools, our teachers, the way that they treat us differently, the school rules in terms of the kinds of gender norms and regulations, the way we sit differently, the kinds of clothes that we might wear, our uniforms and so on, the mass media, all the messages there, our siblings as well as our peers and so on. But what's also important is that it's not a once and for all thing. It's not that we learn to be a girl or a boy perhaps at age 3 or 4 in nursery, but it continues on into adulthood. This is a process, and we keep learning these kinds of roles and rules and norms and ways of being in our encounters in different social contexts throughout our lives. So it's an ongoing process. So how might these mechanisms take place in which we become socialized? Well, there's a whole host of ways, and it's not that we all just simply conform to these practices, these gender practices or ways of expressing our gender identity, but it's that if we don't conform to those gender socialization processes, there are different kinds of methods that might be used to keep us, to regulate our behavior. So, for example, there might be physical sanctions, or there might be rewards. So you might get a gift for being a really competitive boy, for example, or you might be told off if you are a boy and you're wanting to have a doll, or you're wanting to hold the hand of another little boy. There's a whole range of things. It could be it could be physical, but it could also be verbal encouragement or discouragement, that we get subtle cues over time, but also that we might have these different kinds of role models or people that we are looking to, and we imitate that behavior, the mannerisms or the speech from the adults and media in our lives that help us to form our understanding and expectations of how gender should be expressed or not. So I've already kind of made reference to this, but key sites of socialization include the primary site of the family, the secondary site of the school, and tertiary sites, which might include the media, our peers, role models, university, and so on. And we also, it would be interesting for you to just keep an eye out over the next week and think about the different films and TV shows and commercials and videos that you come into contact with, and just have a look to see if you can recognize these different stereotypes that appear in the media. And often they can be hyper stereotypical, I would argue, hyper stereotypical expressions of gender, which I think we're seeing on these two images. And there's a reading that you might want to look at, Tropes versus Women in Video Games, which is, just think about that as you're engaging with your video games and thinking about the different gender stereotypes and what impact that might have on the consumers of the video games. This is a video that I won't stop and show now, but you might want to have a look at. It's really interesting to think about how companies and marketing actually benefits from these gender socialization processes, in which they can target a market in particular ways maybe even with the same product, and make that same product feel different in terms of the look of it, the way that it's marketed, the way that it's packaged, and so on. So we might buy two of the same product, one for the man in the family and one for the woman in the family, because of these gendered signals that this is the appropriate one for him and this is the appropriate one for her. And the idea that we're not just born into our gender. It's really an important part of the sociology of gender, but that we actually practice gender, that we do it. It's through our everyday kind of subtle ways of doing things, the way that we walk, the way that we talk, the tone of our voice, the kinds of ways that we might sit with our legs crossed, with our legs uncrossed, taking up space, holding ourselves in, standing up tall, taking up space, not taking up space, and so on. Just look around you and just see if you can see these different ways that we move through social spaces by doing gender in particular ways. And as I've said before, it's really important to think about this in terms of relations. So gender is accomplished in the ways in which we interact with others, and we provide particular signals or cues that become either consistent or inconsistent, maybe, if we're disrupting those, with the kind of expectations around what masculinity and femininity is and how we might do it. So doing gender is assuming and creating difference between women and men that are not physiological, but that we learn, again, through processes of socialization within institutions. As I say, for example, take the school uniform. That will be different, and it creates those differences. It reproduces those differences over time. And using these assumptions and socially constructed differences reinforces the idea that it's just natural. It's natural that boys don't wear skirts. Is it natural, or is it part of our social construction about what we see as the appropriate way to do a boy, what a boy should wear, and so on? Okay, so I'm going to go on to part 3 in just a moment.